So we've looked at the realism of Goya in Spain and the realism of Daumier and Courbet in France. But I want to emphasize, as I said earlier, in the area of painting, the first half of the 19th century in much of Europe was overwhelmingly a century of Romanticism. Even in France, the impact and importance of Delacroix continues through the first half of the 19th century. Classicism as a philosophical ideal was also pervasive in Europe. But in Germany, painters eventually abandoned classical approaches and references for a more personal, mystical, and often specifically religious vision. A romanticized vision is the way that we are going to characterize it. Now, when I use the name Germany, I'm not talking exactly about the Germany that we know today, although it's approximately the same region. Germany in the late 18th and early 19th centuries consisted politically and geographically, as you can see from this map, of a conglomeration of autonomous or independent small states, principalities, courts. From the period, however, of Napoleon's intervention in German affairs and his final defeat in 1814, many Germans were supporting a nationalist movement that sought to not only expel the French and establish a unified Germany, but to embrace a fully Germanic sense of national identity. And this was difficult to do if you had so many different parts to this region. The Romantic movement in Germany will foster this strong sense of national identity, which I sort of tried to represent, if this makes any sense at all, in this slide. Because despite the permeation of classicism and the interest in the pagan world in Germany, there was increasingly, and one can again point to the Napoleonic Wars here, there was a gradual reorientation in Germany toward an authentic German past. And that would include Christianity and the Christian faith. German artists of the late 18th and early 19th centuries perceived a situation of opposition in terms of classic, or in terms of authentic German art, for instance, and authentic German philosophies as an opposition between Northern Gothic and classical Mediterranean. Does that make sense? Northern Gothic versus classical Mediterranean. The classical Mediterranean world was seen as pagan, whereas the Northern Gothic tradition, of course, emphasizes spirituality, which comes out of Christianity. This conceptual duality between Christian medieval and pagan classical was constantly reflected in the art of the period in Germany, and most specifically, we'll see it manifested in painting. So I've tried to represent it here as the clash of contrasting colors, green and red, the Christian medieval tradition, which is supported in the Germanic tradition, the pagan classical tradition, which, by the way, had been celebrated in Germany because among the most important promoters and theoreticians of the classical world was the German writer Johann Winckelmann. You remember you learned about Winckelmann in one of the very first videos that you looked at on our website. Winckelmann, a German, had lived in Rome for many years. He studied ancient classical pagan art and architecture. He is among those who advocated, if you remember, in the 18th century, the rejection of Baroque and Rococo styles, and said that artists should return to the roots of the classical world, to the imitation of what is Greek. He wrote a history of ancient art, which is a celebration of the Greco-Roman world. And he systematically ordered the art of the classical world by period and style. It was one of the first attempts to try to differentiate between, what was authentically Greek and what was Roman. So even though I have set up for you this contrast, which will increasingly certainly be relevant in the 19th century, keep in mind that there were German scholars like Winkelmann who greatly admired and embraced the classical past. That being said, the German painter Joseph Anton Koch creates a landscape which is considered an example of the classical landscape. We could even say in 1805 we might still be able to call it the neoclassical landscape. Koch, like so many artists in the 18th century, whether from France or the Germanies, had gone to Italy to study art. He had lived in Rome. And his landscape paintings are informed by the influence of classical art. So this is his most famous work, the Landscape with Rainbow. It's a fairly modest work, about 3 feet 8 inches by 3 feet 7 inches. So it's almost a square. What I want you to see in this landscape, and sort of, again, use it almost like we use the Oath of the Horatii to talk about a neoclassical history painting. This is kind of a neoclassical or academic classical landscape, is the great clarity of the composition and the feeling that you get that this is a work in terms of subject matter and the way the composition is organized. It is a classical landscape. In other words, it does not specifically evoke any kind of Germanic sensibility at this point. Now, in France, landscape was considered the enemy of the classical approach to painting because there was too much variety possible and too many uncontrollable variables. In fact, where is landscape on the ladder?
Was it on the lowest?
Yeah. Let's put it down on the lowest rung, if you'll remember, because landscape was rather useless or considered to be unless it really was elevated to the level of a Poussin or a Claude Lorraine, where they bring in some kind of classical details and there is some kind of narrative or story. So what we have by the 17th century coming out of France are treatises on landscape that set forth certain rules establishing formulas for landscape compositions. And if you're going to create a landscape, even though we won't consider it to be on the highest rung, we will consider it to be a good work if it follows according to the rules of classification. And the classifications included the ideal landscape and the pastoral landscape. The ideal landscape would have something heroic or classical perhaps going on in it as a small element within the landscape. That was if you're going to talk about then segregating landscape in terms of classification, that's the highest level of landscape. And below that is the pastoral landscape, which means that you're talking about a kind of rustic landscape with some shepherds and some sheep or whatever, and there really isn't any kind of important narrative or story that's being told. So the ideal in formula is evident in Koch's painting, which was referred to as his great Greek landscape. So what did this formula, what do the rules tell us needed to be done? Well, it involved a number of different elements which together were meant to create an ideal landscape which pulls our eye in, leads our eye around in a very organized fashion, pulls us from one part of the painting to the other, and then into the background where we may focus on something that again can bring us back to the front again. All right, so it's very carefully orchestrated in all of its parts, whereas one might say the funeral at Ornans was not orchestrated in this way. This painting certainly was. What you have are elements that are meant to pull the eye into the work in what are called a series of screens. So you can see it's almost as if this area was painted and then pulled in to the front down below. An area of bushes then, and lighter area pushed in from the right-hand side. And suddenly we see how our eye is being manipulated as different parts of the painting pull into the center. Gestures by individual figures are meant to focus our attention on certain parts of the painting. In this case, it's very pleasant. We have a shepherd who's playing his pipes. We have a large rock, what's called a framing tree. You can have framing figures or framing trees, but they're always meant to keep us in, not to let us escape or fall out away from the edges of the canvas. We see a body of water, and you notice that in terms of value contrast, we're moving in. Light, dark, light, dark. You see that working here. Texture changes slightly. Smoother texture, greater texture. Open space. Space that is filled with trees or architecture in a series of planes that pull us into what is a well-tended world, which literally what you could imagine is we've sent the gardeners out and they have trimmed and pruned everything so that it is a kind of perfect space or landscape that we are looking at. All replete with reminders of the Greco-Roman classical world, with what look like very classical-looking towns with buildings in the distance. The most important thing is that nature has been manicured into a perfectly ideal world. One of the criticisms of classical landscape by what would become now emerging Germanic Romantic landscape painters. And remember, Koch is an academic classical landscape painter. Now I want to turn to what we mean by Romantic landscape painters, was the fact that these artists said that a classical landscape like this lacked relevance. The artist Philipp Otto Runge said, "We are not Greeks." Like other German Romantic artists, Runge wanted to create an art that would be an expression of Germanic sensibilities, of a transcendent voice of nature, which German Romantic painters very much embraced as the inspiration of God. Critics and artists in Germany started drawing attention to the medieval past of Germany, to the Renaissance masters of Germany, and even early Renaissance masters in Italy, because it was felt that they, in fact, had embraced religious feeling and mysticism, which was lacking from paintings such as the work of Koch. The artist whose self-portrait you're looking at here is the German Romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich. Friedrich's art developed in a period when melancholy was highly fashionable, but it also resulted in his own personal melancholia. He was described as being large and shy, with always a kind of melancholic expression on his face. So do we know what melancholia is, or melancholy? So who wants to know? So who wants to Google it?
Well, it's generally sad, isn't it?
Very self-reflective, often very sad, often to the point of depression, a kind of melancholia. But it was actually thought that melancholia was a characteristic of all artists, who think and experience things so deeply. But in fact, we find a kind of overwhelming sense of melancholia in the work of Caspar David Friedrich, whose perception of nature was nature as a religious experience. In looking at his work, we begin to understand that overwhelming feeling of nature, which is not understandable to humans, which is unfathomable in terms of our existence, and which is certainly not ever manicured. Friedrich said, quote, "The artist should paint not only what he sees before him, but what he sees within him." That's a German Romantic painter. The artist should paint not only what he sees before him, but also what he sees within him. What I show you here is a very famous Friedrich called Monk by the Sea. Unlike the traditional sort of Western academic landscape, again, think Koch that we were just looking at, meaning is evoked here not by adding those little figures that we saw in the Koch landscape to move us in, but in fact it is the landscape that is the major protagonist and has a very strong voice in whatever narrative the artist wishes to represent here. Monk by the Sea is a work full of tension. So first of all, what we have to understand is that we are present here as well. We're understood to be present here. And we've come out, and in the distance, can you see the figure of the monk there, the religious figure? Very summarily rendered. In fact, basically, he has his back to us. And he is standing on some cliffs, and then you have this soupy, black, activated sea, and then this thick fog that's just grabbing and holding onto the sea, and then a little bit of clarity in terms of the sky or the heaven up above. The point here is that that monk is, again, although we're standing outside the painting, we enter it and we become that monk. We are that speck. We are that nothing in nature. And it's confronting us and making us painfully aware about how unimportant and alone we are in the world. In fact, in this painting, Friedrich has first introduced what the Germans will call the Rückenfigur. My German, by the way, always sounds like French because French is my second language. So, but Rückenfigur here, literally it means a back figure, a figure male or female seen from the back, engaged in contemplation of nature. The function of a Rückenfigur is to invite us into the painting. Another important work by Friedrich is this one called Abbey in Oakwood, in which again we are confronted by the overpowering knowledge of the finality of death. This is a landscape with a Gothic ruin, part of a church that we see as a kind of focal point. That's clearly a Gothic window that we see in the architecture that survives. And the ruins are within a forest of very barren oak trees. And again, it's the landscape that is predominant here, but if we look closely, we actually see some more monks here, and they are walking away from us toward that ruined portion of a church, and they're actually carrying a coffin, because it's quite clear to us as we look around that this is a kind of destroyed church, but there's still a graveyard here that is in use. The ruins perhaps represent the deterioration of the Christian church. The oak trees are symbols of the pagan life or pagan tradition. And again, this is meant to make us reflect in a very deep sense the absoluteness of death. Now, Friedrich was a devout Christian, so the fact is, although he understood about the absoluteness of death, it was not absolute if one believed in resurrection through Jesus Christ. One of Friedrich's most famous works, in fact, was designed as an altarpiece, as a Christian altarpiece for a private patron. It's called Cross in the Mountains, or the Teschen Altar. And the date is 1808. The idea here for Friedrich was that he would paint a landscape, and the landscape was the subject matter of the altarpiece. Have you ever heard of that? So what have you heard of that would be the subject matter for an altarpiece? Mary and Jesus, Christ enthroned, God the Father. So these are more traditional subjects, not a landscape. But Friedrich, of course, saw his art differently. And the idea to use a landscape as the subject of an altarpiece is an innovation. And it was criticized for its presumption that a pure landscape could, in fact, be a kind of explicit religious message. Important to understand here is that the cross in the mountains does not actually show a crucifixion, because one could say, well, a crucifixion can be the subject of an altarpiece. That's not a crucifixion. What you're seeing is a cross bearing a statue of Christ, a carved wooden cross and statue of the kind that could be found in the mountains in Germany, where one could go and pray in front of it, and not Germany, but much of Central Europe. So this really is a pure landscape painting that has, of course, a subject which is relevant to its function. In defense of his landscape as altarpiece, Friedrich wrote that the painting could be interpreted as a Christian allegory. He said, the setting sun is God. The trees, the fir trees on the mountain and the ivy growing on the cross are representations of faith and hope. Compositionally, as in other works by Friedrich that we've looked at, I want you to notice something. He's not into transitions. He has a foreground and a background. Have you noticed that? There is just this basic kind of foreground, dark or light area, and a background, dark or light area in contrast to it. So he creates a work that compositionally is very compressing. The frame was carved with specific instructions from the painter and is an important part of the whole symbolic content of the altar. The picture and the frame combine to give an impression, Friedrich said, of looking out of a window. Thus, the altarpiece can be understood as a glimpse out of a restricted or confined space, which is our lives, I suppose, our finite existence. And we look out toward the world of God, the realm of the spiritual beyond. Notice in some of the details that were carved on this extraordinary frame, this triangle shape, the symbol of the Holy Trinity with the eye of God at the very center, and then the beams of light emanating out, the heads of angels up above, carved among ears of corn and shafts of wheat, and then we have grain and grapes as symbols of Holy Communion, the bread and the wine of the Eucharistic feast. So it's a very complex work in its parts, telling us specifically that it is a deeply spiritual work, and this is understood through its subject, which landscape for Friedrich was a deeply spiritual way of expression, along with the traditional symbols. With the exhibition of his work in Dresden and Berlin and Weimar between 1808 and 1812, Friedrich made himself quite a reputation. The only other German Romantic painter who is on par with Friedrich is this man, Philipp Otto Runge. Who died at the age of 33 and left very few works. Runge, like Friedrich, was a deeply religious man with a strongly romantic, mystical temperament. So let me ask you something, and you may feel this is a strange question, but have you ever lain down, especially in a meadow or on grass, and maybe on the side, and so your ear was right near the grass, and did you kind of, no, don't think I'm crazy, did you kind of hear the earth in your ear? Did you kind of hear the blades of grass or hear the earth? Someone saying yes. Did you get a sense almost, that the earth is alive? Now, maybe that they're just little bugs buzzing around underneath your ear, something like that. But I've had that. Experience before, and it's just the most tingly, wonderful experience of sort of being embraced by the earth, and the earth sort of speaking. Friedrich wrote, this is a quote, "When the sky above me shimmers with countless stars, the wind whispers through the broad space, the waves break with a roar in the distant night, the air reddens over the woods, and the sun lights up the world. The valley is damp, and I throw myself onto the grass amidst the glittering dewdrops. Every leaf and blade of grass shimmers with life. The earth comes to life and moves beneath me, and everything harmonizes in accord. And then my soul leaps up and flies above in the immeasurable space around me. I hear and feel the living breath of God, the most exalted experience possible, God." Now, I'm not going that far, but after all, this is nature. You are, when you're lying down like that, you're so close to nature and to the earth. This sense of spiritual ecstasy is what Runge attempted to capture in his landscape paintings. But his intense feeling of the universal could not be expressed in conventional forms of landscape painting. And his art developed in a very different kind of way. As he matured, he felt that Germany had an essence far more relevant for his personal artistic inspiration, and he wanted German art to move in that more spiritual direction. He wanted a mystical unity in his work with the natural world. This is one of his most famous works, and this is the last work we'll look at today, The Rest on the Flight into Egypt, which is a story that comes out of the birth and childhood of Jesus from the Gospel according to Matthew, in which Joseph, who was not the biological father of Jesus, but his father, was warned that King Herod was about to order the death of all babies who had been born in and around Bethlehem. And Joseph packed up Mary and Jesus, and they went into Egypt. Painting for Runge was a religious act, and this work was designed as an altarpiece, which was ultimately rejected because it was considered too mystical and too difficult to understand, to the extent that those people who might look at it in a church setting would not, in fact, be able to relate to the narrative, to the story. It was a little too strange, in other words. What we see is a kind of fantastical place where it would appear that Joseph and Mary have spent the night. They are about to now make off to the land of Egypt. And we see Joseph at the left extinguishing a fire, while Mary half kneels at the right, clasping her hands, and she looks down on the baby Jesus as the light of the sun seems to rise in the distance, and Jesus seems to sort of open his arms to the light of the sun. Runge had sought to paint a kind of miracle here. Ultimately, this was meant to represent the miracle of redemption, the miracle of salvation. But it is a very strange work. You need only look up in the tree just above, and then you start to see some little figures here, little angelic figures, who perhaps Christ is communing with at this moment in time. Runge died at a very early age. Many works went unfinished. Others he destroyed at the end of his life because he had an ambition to create a total spiritual experience, to design a Gothic building, to create poetry and music and paintings to put into that building. And he was only able to produce fragments of what his intentions were. This is a work called Morning, which he designed. And does that look like a doll? It doesn't look like a real baby. It's very strange. Okay.